if you can search your craniums to remember all the way back to week 4, you remember that I talked about the kind of intellectual milieu, or whatever you want to call it. The atmosphere at that time was that people were trying to force language and force ways of thinking into this very mathematical logic. And the Cambridge School of Ordinary Language Philosophy, I'm going to try to do it with this mask on instead of my duck face mask, but it's a little bit more difficult. And so people in the ordinary language, the School of Ordinary Language Philosophy at Oxford, we talked about Austin and Searle, and the next one we're talking about is Grice. So this week we're talking about Grice, is also from that. And so he noticed that, kind of like what Austin was talking about, that language isn't just some abstract mathematical system. It's a system of behavior by people. It's action. It's situated social action. And so it's not held by the same rules as mathematical logic. Logic had just become mathematized. Before, like Aristotle's logic wasn't very mathematical, but at the beginning of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell and Moore and Frege and a few other people tried to make logic into basically mathematics, or mathematize it. And then that influenced how people looked at language, because they tried to then apply that to language, and it really doesn't work. So if we look at logic, you have something like simple like negation, which can be marked in logic either with a tilde or this symbol, the exclamation point. So in logic, it's a very simple thing that negation always has the role of negation. So if you have not P, that means P meaning any proposition, right? So they often use P and Q as any proposition. So in this case, P is anything, and if you say not P, that's the negation of P. And if you say not P, then that means the same thing as P, right? So that's very straightforward logic. And so one of the things in logic is they're trying to do is have certainty. Philosophers really want to find certainty. They want to find truth. They kind of go about it the wrong way. But anyway, this is what they're after. The problem is in natural language, when you say I'm not unhappy, it doesn't mean you're happy, right? If somebody says, are you happy? And you say, I'm not unhappy, that doesn't mean you're happy. That means you're kind of somewhere between not happy and happy, right? And also, sometimes we have negation where it's not really double negation. It's not, negations don't negate each other. So like, I ain't doing nothing. Just means I'm not doing anything, right? So you can have two negators in there, but it still comes out as a single negation. It doesn't mean positive. When you say I ain't doing nothing, doesn't mean you are doing something. And something like this is a cartoon from the New Yorker, where he says, "See what I mean? You're never sure just where you stand with them, because the mat, instead of saying welcome, says not unwelcome." Right, which is a very different meaning from welcome, because normally your mat would say welcome, and people's like, oh yeah, welcome. But not unwelcome is like, maybe I should go in, maybe I shouldn't go in. And they also, Grice noticed that logical conjunction, basically and, which can be marked with this symbol in logic or this symbol, doesn't really mean the same thing in English and logic. So in logic, conjunction just means conjunction. So if you have this and this, it's this. If you have like P and Q, that's exactly the same thing as Q and P, right? So any two propositions, you reverse the order, it doesn't change. But in natural language, it doesn't work that way. So they got married and had a baby. You can respond to that and say, no, they had a baby and got married. Because we very often talk about the order of things happening in the order in which they actually happened. And so we take this and thing as meaning and then. We just assume that the and means and then kind of a meaning. So it's very different from logic. Sometimes, actually, though, it does mean, and then in a very strict sense. So like this one, this is a peanut butter that I often eat. And when I first bought it, it said, I saw this, it said oil separation is natural, stir and refrigerate, right? So thinking it from the logic point of view, I could either refrigerate it first or stir it first, and it wouldn't matter. Wrong. If you refrigerate it first, you cannot stir it. It becomes like a rock. So then the oil is on top and the peanut butter is at the bottom, and it's really difficult to stir. So you have to stir it first and then refrigerate it. So when they say stir and refrigerate, they mean do it in that order. Don't think in terms of logic, but think in terms of normal human language. Then there's another thing which is called material implication. So P implies Q, right? You can write it this way, you can write it this way. So it's kind of if P, then Q is often the way it's said. And so another way of talking about it is if you put in negation, you could say not the junction of P and Q and not Q, or not P or Q. This is the symbol for or. Now, this is the thing you learned in semantics and pragmatics or whatever course that was, where they make these truth tables. So true, it's always true if P is false. So this material implication is always true if P is false, regardless of the truth of Q. It's only false when P is true and Q is false. So if you look at this table, of course it's true when both are true, but if Q is false, it's false. But even if P is false, Q is still true. And even if both are false, it's still true. So this is really very different from natural language, because we don't talk that way. So if you say he's my brother's son, then he's my nephew, it's true whether or not he's my brother's son if he is my nephew, and true if both statements are false. If a triangle has only two sides, then the triangle has three sides, right? So that's a nonsense sentence, but it's actually true by their way of thinking. If I look like George Clooney, which of course is true, then Singapore is a tropical country. So this is necessarily a true statement, right? And then the weird thing is in standard language, we can say, if you're free, I'll be in my office, where these two things actually have nothing to do with each other, right? So they're not. It's not a condition. It's not like if. So even though we say it as if you're free, I will be in my office. I'll be in my office whether or not you're free. But it's just I'm allowing you to know that I'll be in my office. So if you're free, you can come by. So this is one of these things where the natural language really diverges from logic, because this wouldn't make sense in logic. And this was an email exchange that we had. I had written to people that Peter Trudgill was coming, and I said, see the message below from Peter Trudgill. Would you all be around at that time? If you don't know Peter, he's a really great guy, a great linguist, and lots of fun. And then B, of course, knows who Trudgill is. He said, who is this dude? Never heard of him, right? So what am I supposed to infer from that, right? From this obviously false statement. And another one where I said, that is my guess as well. I'm pretty clueless about cleaning agents. My helper had asked me to buy some cleaning agents, and I didn't know anything about cleaning agents, even though I actually cleaned the place before she comes to eat sweets, including the toilet. And B says, you do housework, I'm a good baker. So her meaning here is maybe not obvious to those of you who don't know her. So she's questioning that I actually do housework, and she says I'm a good baker. Now I know that she's not a good baker. She cooks some things well, but she's not a good baker. So by saying I'm a good baker, she's implying that she doesn't believe that I do housework. So, well, how do we get that meaning? So this is what's called implicature, and this is the other thing that Grice had picked up on, that we often don't actually say the meaning that we want the person to create. That the main meaning we're trying to get across is not what we say, it's what we hope the meaning that we hope they create, which is kind of an implication but he gave it the fancy name of implicature to narrow it down. So this one, hey Ben, how was the paperwork today? It was all right, just time consuming. When you think about it, isn't everything we do time consuming? All of our actions require a sacrifice of time towards the abyss of what becomes our past. Life is simply a countdown accompanied by our occupations as a distraction from the essence of reality. When you think about it, life itself is time consuming. And the other guy walks away saying, I'll see you tomorrow, Jim. And Jim is still thinking. So what happened here is, when you say time consuming, you're not supposed to take it as a, you're supposed to be able to infer some kind of implication from it, the relevance of it to the paperwork, right? So of course it's time consuming, but what does it mean to be time consuming in this context? And what is the intention of the speaker in saying that? Or this one, I heard a rumor that you have 2 jobs and you outsourced both of them to Albonia and keep the difference. That's crazy. I assure you, I do not have 2 jobs outsourced to Albonia. Is it more than 2? That's a different conversation, right? So here it looks like he's totally just denying the thing, but the guy picks up on the fact that what he denied was that possibly only that there's only 2 jobs, not more than 2 jobs. So again, the meaning is not all in the wording. There's lots of other things going on here, and this is what Grice picked up on. To be perfectly honest, wait. Why do you need to say you're being honest in this particular case? You're implying that you've lied to me so often in the past that in this one instance of honesty is noteworthy. That is tantamount to admitting that you have no respect for me as a human being. And you don't even have the decency to hide your evil in a competent fashion. Do you think I'm such an idiot that I wouldn't notice your verbal assault on my intelligence? Okay, let's hear the one honest thing you have ever told me. Go. And the guy thinks, this is going to be the easiest lie I've ever told, right? So the key thing is to be perfectly honest. Why do we say things like to be perfectly honest? Right? So what is going on there? So that's the kind of things we're going to be talking about. Or in this one, this is a grad student talking to the supervisor, and he said, I finally read the draft you sent me, and it's not bad. Is it good? It's not good. Could be worse. Are you saying it could be better? There's room for improvement. Should I rewrite it? It can't hurt. I wish you'd give me more concrete advice. It could be worse. So those of you doing your FYP with me, this is what your sessions are going to look like. No, just kidding. But this kind of thing does happen. So the idea is, when somebody's saying something, they're not being very exact about what they're saying, and you have to infer what they mean by it. So this is an extreme example of trying to figure out, okay, exactly what do you mean by saying these things? So this is all called implicature. So what are the implications of what we say, basically? So when you say something like, can you tell me the time? You're literally saying, supposedly, do you have the ability to tell me the time, right? So, and the person answers, well, the milkman has come, which seems like a totally irrelevant answer to, do you have the ability to tell me the time? It seems like the answer should be yes or no. We already know about indirect speech acts, but this is actually a direct speech act. Can you tell me the time? But it's indirect in the sense of, it's direct in the sense that it's a question, but it's indirect in the sense that it's questioning the person's ability to tell the time, not just saying, please tell me the time. Then the person says, well, the milkman has come, which supposedly, you say, well is a pragmatically interpreted particle, supposedly, which means, generally, well is often used to mean something like, I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but I'll tell you the part that's most relevant. And so here, the milkman came at some point prior to the time of speaking. So the answer, if you are privy to the idea, if you know when the milkman usually comes, then you will know that at least it's after the time that the milkman usually comes. So even though the person doesn't have the exact answer, so the well there kind of triggers the idea that I don't have the exact answer, but I'll tell you something that might be useful to you, and that's what well does as a discourse particle. The milkman has come. We'll talk about discourse particles later on. And so what is meant is, the first question was, do you have the ability to tell me the time of the present moment as standardly indicated on a watch? And if so, please do so. Tell me what time it is. And B says, no, I don't know the exact time of the present moment, but I can provide some information which you may be able to deduce, from which you may be able to deduce the approximate time. Namely, the milkman came at some time prior to the time of speaking. So from that, the person can create the meaning that the speaker intends for the person to create. Or if you say something, if Rose says, did you bring the flowers and the card? And Jim says, oh, I brought the flowers. Then what's the implication there? He didn't bring the card, right? So, or Jim says, are you going away for Christmas? And Mick says, I've got dogs. What's the implication there? Their implicature, that he can't go away, because if you have dogs, you have to have somebody take care of, unless you put them in a doggy hotel or something like that. I don't know, do you have doggy hotels here? In America, we have doggy hotels where you can put your dogs in a hotel and go away. Where are you going with the dog? Sam says, where are you going with the dog? And Vic says, to the VET. Right? Now, why would he say VET instead of vet? Because the dog understands, of course, and dogs are a lot smarter than you think. And so they understand, and they would get upset. So you spell in front of the dog. Tim says, do you like beer? And Joe says, is the Pope Catholic? Why would you say that? Right? That's actually a pretty common saying. Is the Pope Catholic? That's an answer that means what? Of course. So that's we can create meanings out of what these people say, even though it seems in a very unusual way of answering a question. Or the kind of thing when you say, what are you doing? And the person says nothing. Is it really they're doing nothing, or it's just they're not doing anything that happens to be relevant at the time, or relevant or worth mentioning at the time? Or what did you do yesterday morning? I went to work, that's all. Right? Of course, he did lots of things, but there's nothing relevant to talk about other than just went to work, and it's not relevant to talk about all the things he did at work. So he just said, I went to work, that's all. But this differs, how much you go into the details will differ depending on your context. So, for example, a witness being questioned in a trial might, if they say, what did you do on the morning of Friday the 10th of April? They might say, I woke up at 7:40, I made some toast and a cup of tea, I listened to the news, left for work about 8:30. Or they might go into total detail. I woke up in bed, I was wearing pajamas. After lying still for a few minutes, I threw back the quilt, got out of bed, walked to the door of the bedroom, opened the door, switched on the landing light, walked across the landing, opened the bedroom door. We leave out normally we would leave out all of these details about what we did, and we would just say something, a summary of the kind of main kind of details, I guess you might call it. So we pick and choose what is relevant in the context, and we give the information that's relevant in that particular context. But we can also say things that seem crazy, like hyperbole. My car breaks down every 5 minutes. Of course, it doesn't really break down every 5 minutes. It just means it very frequently, because every 5 minutes is a very frequent time interval. So my car breaks down very frequently would just mean the car breaks down very often. Or I have a million bottles of wine in my cellar. Of course, you don't really have a million bottles of wine. That would be a very big cellar. To maybe somebody does. Trump maybe does. I don't know. But most people, that would just mean they have a lot of bottles. More than what you would expect. So you could say a million bottles. And also when you say things like metaphor, Queen Victoria was made of iron. irony or sarcasm. I love it when you sing out of tune when the person's you really don't like when the person sings out of tune, but you say I love it when you sing out of tune, as a kind of sarcastic way of saying it. But the person can understand all of these things. Now, how do they understand it? If we actually get meaning from the words, then that's really problematic. The meaning that we're getting is not the words themselves. We're creating some other meaning out of it. So this is all to H. Paul Grice. Is famous for his theory of natural versus non-natural meaning. So this is something I think is problematic about his work, that he actually separated meaning into so-called natural and non-natural meaning, as if there is some kind of meaning outside of our heads. So like he used, well, I'm really having trouble breathing in this mask. When I inhale it, I get sucked into my mouth. The other one is like really sticks out, so it doesn't bother me. So I may have to switch later. So his theory of natural versus non-natural meaning is like, if you look at the sky and you see dark clouds, he said, that means rain, and that's a natural meaning. Whereas the meaning in our words and stuff is non-natural meaning. But actually that's problematic, because you have to create the meaning that those black clouds mean rain. So that's still non-natural meaning. It's not in the clouds itself, it's in your evaluation of the clouds. But the other thing he's famous for is cooperative principle. And we'll talk about his cooperative principle in detail, and the so-called maxims that go with it, used to explain the evoking of implicatures. Like, how do we do this? The main thing is that, very much like Austin, he argued that conversation differs from logic because it is situated action. And so what he's talking about actually isn't even limited to language. It's really about our interactions. So his meaning of theory of meaning, the speaker meant not naturally, by uttering an utterance if and only if. IFF means if and only if. The speaker intended the utterance to cause some effect, Z in the Z, you say here, in the recipient in the addressee. And two, the speaker intended one to be achieved simply by the addressee recognizing that intention. Okay. It's not easy to see this, but especially the way I just mangled up the reading of it. But what he's talking about here is that just by an addressee or one person noticing the other person's intent to communicate, they have already communicated, right? So this is what I mean when I talk about the ostensive act getting your attention and also constraining the interpretation, because just by getting your attention, that begins the conversation there. So the speaker intends for the utterance to cause some effect, and causes that effect just by the other person recognizing the intention to cause that effect. So that's what this is saying. This is from him. And his cooperative principle, he stated it, you probably learned this before, but most people don't really understand this, because he stated it in a very difficult kind of way. He said, make your conversational contribution as such as it is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. And then he talked about these maxims, which everybody misunderstood as well. Basically, though, one of the reasons why I like Green's book is she presents a paraphrase of Grice's cooperative principle as simply individuals act in accordance with their goals. Grice had defined rationality as acting according to goals, right? So a rational person has goals, and what they do is geared towards achieving those goals. And the reason why we can communicate is that we expect people to be acting in accordance with some goals. In other words, there's this principle of rationality, what he called it. It's that we assume that each other is rational, unless you're talking to Trump. You assume everyone is rational, and so when they say something, you expect them to have a particular reason for saying it. They're not just babbling for the sake of it, right? And so you try to make sense of it. However you need to, you will try to make sense of it. And so this is where the implicature comes in, because it allows you to make sense of things that don't seem straightforward. But actually, we use the same ability to understand. It's not really a special kind of thing. It's what we do all the time. But at least at his point in the 1960s, when he first came up with this, in a series of lectures in 1968 at Harvard. And it was very much a step forward then, but he still was seeing that there was kind of so-called literal meaning and then the implicature on top of that. So it's like a two-part thing. And there are some theories like relevance theory that still work with that kind of two-part thing, what they call an explicature and an implicature, or sentence meaning and speaker meaning. But it's really not two things. It's not really a bifurcation like that. It's really just one thing going on. But this was really a step forward in understanding that this was situated action with people acting according to goals, and that the fact that we assume that they are rational, which means we assume that they are acting according to goals, is what allows us to communicate. Because we assume this principle of relevance. We assume that what somebody says is going to be relevant in some way. So this is why there's a theory now called relevance theory, which just talks about relevance. But with Grice, he broke it down into relevance being only one of the things that's what's going on. So his maxims are really just special cases of the cooperative principle. In other words, they're not something separate from the cooperative principle. They're just kind of like examples of how the cooperative principle works. So when somebody is acting in accordance to some goal and you try to guess it, then you guess it. In other words, you have to create some kind of meaning to guess their intention in what they're doing. And he talked about these maxims as kind of aspects that are played with in doing that. So the quantity maxim is make your contribution as informative as required for the current purposes of exchange. Do not make your contribution more informative than is required. And Green paraphrases that as an agent will do as much as is required for the achievement of the current goal. An agent will not do more than is required. This is actually a very old principle that was first talked about by a guy named George von der Gambelens in Germany in the late 19th century, where he talked about the idea that you don't say more than you need to. There's an aim for comfort, but then there's an aim for clarity. So you have to say as much as you need to, but not any more than that. So that's the quantity maxim. Basically, it's just what's sometimes called Zipf's principle, because there was also a book in 1940s by a guy named Zipf who talked about this in much more detail. The relationship between the the desire to say as little as possible, but at the same time to be as clear as necessary. And so then there's also the quality maxim. Do not say what you believe to be false. Do not say that for which you lack adequate evidence. And Green paraphrases this as agents will not deceive co-agents. So this is more really a kind of trust thing. It's can you believe the other person? And ideally you shouldn't lie to the other person, but that's more of a moral kind of thing rather than a conversational thing. The relation one is just be relevant. So Green's paraphrase in this case is longer than his statement. An agent's action will be relevant to and relative to an intention of the agent. So in other words, whatever you say will be relevant in some way. So when you, like the milkman has come, that seems like a totally non sequitur type of answer, but you assume the person's rational, so you assume that what they say must be relevant somehow. So then you think, okay, how can that be relevant? And then you try to come up with, say, okay, well, I know the milkman comes at 12 o'clock, so it must be after 12 o'clock. So that's how you make sense of it. You make it relevant in some way. And in manner, be perspicuous. Avoid obscurity of expression. Avoid ambiguity. Be brief. Avoid unnecessary prolixity. Be orderly. And as Green talks about, I think in her book, she said this seems like a little joke that he's playing, because he's saying, don't use too many words. And yet he uses a lot of words, big words, and things like perspicuous and avoid unnecessary prolixity. When be brief is good enough, actually. So it's like he's violating his own manner maxim here in this expression of it. But it's basically don't say any more than you need to be, and also be orderly is the one we talked about. Like they got married and had a baby, so you say things in the order in which they happened. That's to be orderly, or you say them in a way that will help the other person to understand what's going on. So it's not like, Pulp Fiction or some Tarantino movie where everything happens in weird order, and then you have trouble understanding what's going on. So Green's paraphrase of this is quite long. Agents will make their actions perspicuous to others which they share a joint intention. Agents will not disguise actions from co-agents. Consequently, agents will not speak obscurely in attempting to communicate. Agents will act so that intentions they intend to communicate are unambiguously reconstructible. Agents will spend no more energy on actions than is necessary, and agents will execute some parts of a plan in an order that will maximize the perceived likelihood of achieving the goal. So she got even more wordy than him. So implicature is speech that seems to violate the maxims. And so in order to make sense of it, because of the assumption of rationality, you then have to work in, do some kind of inference, some abductive inference, to say, okay, why did this person say this? It doesn't seem to be kind of a straightforward response to whatever I'm asking or whatever is supposed to be said. So there must be some way in which the speaker's utterance is in accord with some particular goal. And so the hearer has to create these assumptions or propositions and add them to the context of interpretation in order to make the speaker's utterance make sense. So it's kind of like what we talked about with presuppositions, but in this case, it's the actual what is asserted is you have to create that meaning as well. So like this one, the kid says, can Zoe and I watch TV until dinner is ready? And she says, sure, just leave all the work to me. I don't need any help changing the sheets or making a salad or setting the table. I don't even need anybody to keep an eye on Ren while I stir the gravy. I love doing everything around here by myself. And she's screaming. And the kid comes back and tells his sister, she said, sure. They can watch TV. So obviously he has ignored the actual intent of her ostensive act here because it's in his interest to ignore it. It's like the example we had before about the ice cream. Can we buy ice cream? It's like, what do you think? It's like, yeah, I think we can. Totally missing the intent of that expression. So this is the same kind of thing. That's it. Just sit there and do nothing while I move our heavy furniture and lift our heavy rugs. Okay, Helga, what a gal. She doesn't want me to hurt my back. So these kind of things, because they involve this but they involve this abductive inference to be understood properly, people sometimes miss them. They don't get it, right? The penny doesn't drop, as we say sometimes. That our table manners, sometimes they do get it, and then they're not so sure. So because it is meant, sometimes we do this as a way of not being very straightforward. Like in this case, Dad, our table manner is important. Of course, after all, you never know when you'll be invited to dine with the King and Queen of England. And the boy asks, is that your way of saying they're not important? And he says, maybe, but don't tell your mother I said so. So, of course, that's really what he meant, but he didn't want to say it straightforwardly, so he used implicature to get that point across. So, Grice's theory of implicature is that the speaker, by saying P, conversationally implicates Q, another proposition, if and only if the speaker is presumed to be observing the maxims, or at least in the case of floutings, the cooperative principle. In order to maintain the assumption in one, it must be presupposed that the speaker thinks that Q, in other words, believes that proposition. The speaker thinks that both the speaker and the addressee mutually expect that the addressee can work out that to preserve the assumption in one, Q is in fact required, and so will be inferred by the addressee. So, this is kind of a convoluted way of saying something quite simple. It's just that number one is the speaker is presumed to be observing the maximum. In other words, the speaker is assumed to be acting rationally. So that's what one is. The speaker is assumed to be acting rationally. So that means he has a goal. And in order to maintain that assumption that he's acting rationally, it must be the case that the speaker thinks whatever the implicature is. And the speaker thinks that both the speaker and the hearer will both create that meaning in order to preserve the idea that the speaker is rational. Is that clear? So it's really all about rationality, that we assume people are acting rationally, which means they're acting in accordance with some goal. And so no matter how weird the thing is that they do, we try to figure out what the goal is. So this is what I've been talking about from the beginning when I say you infer the person's intentions in what they do. This all started with Grice's intuition here about rationality. Now, they talked about calculating implicatures, which just means the inferential process that you might go through in so-called calculating the implicature. So the conventional content of the sentence is uttered. So if you say something like, the milkman just came, and then the cooperative principle and its maxims, you're assumed to be rational. The context of P, in other words, the situation in which you're in this case, the fact that somebody just asked a question, do you know what time it is? So that's the context, and the relevance then is that, okay, he's expecting an answer about time. And certain bits of background information. So in this case, the background information is that you know when the milkman comes. And then also that all of this is mutual information that the speaker can expect the hearer to know, and the hearer knows that the speaker can expect the hearer to know. It's a very reciprocal kind of thing. So once you have all of that, this is what I was talking about earlier as forming your context of interpretation, and so then the person's action makes sense. Once you bring all of this together, then to draw the implicature or the abductive inference that he said that because he doesn't know the exact time, but he's telling me that something that I know the time of, which is the milkman coming, has happened, so then I can figure out what time it is now from that. So language is actually, this is something I don't know if I've talked about much in this class, but something I always say is language is actually simple. If you read Chomsky stuff and a lot of the other theoretical linguistics, it looks like language is very complicated. Actually, language is really very simple. It's just a bunch of words, one following the other. The complicated part is in the inferences that we make in figuring out why somebody put those words together in that way. And so that's the interesting part. But people trying to, like, I mentioned how with the speech acts, how some of Chomsky's early students tried to even say that all of the meaning of the speech act was in even something like "get out of here." There was an unspoken structure. I order you to get out of here, and all of that was in some deep structure that got lost on the way to the actual statement. So they're trying to build everything that's happening, all the meaning and all the structure, into the form itself, which is really backwards. It's all of the meaning and all of the structure is actually created in our minds. If you have, just to take a very simple example, I've seen people talk about the example of green teacup, where they say, oh, you can analyze it, and they draw these trees. Is it green and then teacup, or is it green tea and then cup? And saying that the form has these two structures, and it's not that the form has these two structures. The form is just three words, and they're just boom, boom, boom. There's nothing else there. What we create when we look at it are simply heuristics to help us to make sense of what the person intends by using the form. So, heuristic is just something, it's not something that's like a fact. It's something you use to get to something else, to understand something else. And basically all of our linguistic theories, all of our way of thinking about language is just heuristics. In other words, it's all just ways to help us understand what's going on. And so that's why there's no right and wrong in linguistics. It's just which ways of looking at it help you more than others, depending on your purpose, actually. So it depends partly on your purpose. That's a little side tangent. So the general pattern for working out an implicature is the speaker has said that P, in other words, said some proposition, like the milkman has come. There's no reason to think the speaker is not observing the maxims, or at least the cooperative principle. So you assume the person's rational. There's no reason to think he's not rational. In order for the speaker to say that the milkman has come and be indeed observing the maxims of the cooperative principle, then the speaker must think that Q, in other words, that it's 12 o'clock or it's just past 12 o'clock if we both know that the milkman comes at 12 o'clock. So that's the way you work out an implicature. But it's just basically abductive inference. The speaker must know that it's mutual knowledge that Q must be presupposed if the speaker is to be taken to be cooperating. So in other words, the speaker has to, in this case, it's not really know. You have to guess that there's this the hearer can create this meaning. The speaker has done nothing to stop me, the addressee, from thinking that. So if I'm the addressee, the speaker hasn't stopped me from creating that meaning. In other words, has not constrained my context of interpretation in any particular way that would stop me from thinking that. Therefore, the speaker intends me to think that Q, in other words, that whatever, like say it's 12 o'clock or whatever the answer is. And in saying that P has implicated that. So by saying the mailman has just come, he's implying it's just afternoon. So this is how you would do, this is one way of talking about it, how you would do these inferences. Now, one of the things we have in language is hedges, and Ewell points out that these hedges are evidence of the importance of the maxims. It shows the speakers are not only aware of the maxims, not really the maxims, but the idea that you should kind of take certain things into account, but also that they want to show that they're trying to observe them. So it's not that people really know the maxims. But we know that we shouldn't lie. We know we should speak in a way that people can understand. I mean, that's just common sense. So like with the quality maxim, we have a lot of hedges that if you don't know the actual answer, you could say, well, as far as I know, or I may be mistaken, but I thought, or I'm not sure if this is right, but I heard, or you say the answer and then you say, I guess. Or many, many years ago, back in like 1980, 81, I taught in 1980 or so, I taught in China. I taught English for a while in China, and students would always ask me questions about things outside of language. And so they would ask me, and I'd say, well, I don't know, but then I would give them an answer. And then they say, why do you always say you don't know, and then give us the answer? And it's like, well, because I don't know for sure whether that my answer is right. Nothing I say it's all subjective. So how can I be sure that my answer is right? I can just say I don't know for sure. and then give you what I think might be the answer, and let you decide if it's the right answer. And that was something totally new to them, because teachers aren't supposed to talk like that. Teachers are supposed to know the answer and tell you the answer. They told me, I was in Hunan, and then I was going to Shanghai, and they said, if you go to Shanghai, Shanghai students are really tough. Don't ever say you don't know something. They'll eat you up. But it's just a different kind of attitude. As a teacher, you can't know everything, so you should acknowledge when you don't know. So we have these things in language like, I don't know, but, or as far as I know, or I may be mistaken, but when we're not sure of something. Quantity maxim, as you probably know, so when you say something like as you probably know, normally the idea is you're not sure if the person knows it or not, but you're going to tell them anyway. But just to be polite to them, you say, as you probably know. But if you really thought they knew, you wouldn't say it. So you think you need to say it, but in order to kind of minimize it or hedge that, you say, I probably don't know. Or if you're, you could tell a long story, but you say, to cut a long story short. So you're telling the person, okay, I could tell you a long story, but I'm going to cut it short. I'm going to tell you a short story. I'm not going to tell you the full quantity that I could tell you. Or I won't bore you with all the details, but it was an exciting trip. And relevance. A lot of times when you're talking and you're talking about one topic and then you want to change the topic, you will say something like, oh, by the way, or anyway, and then people know, okay, we're changing to a different topic, so anything we say will not be relevant to that earlier topic. So when I evaluate the relevance of something, it's going to be in a different framework than the earlier framework. I don't know if this is important, but, and then you can say something that may or may not be relevant. This may sound like a dumb question, or not to change the subject, but all of these things can be used in that type of context. And with manner, you're supposed to say things very clearly and whatever, but sometimes you really haven't worked it out yourself in how to say it very clearly. So you might say, oh, this may be a bit confused. But I remember being in a car and there was this and this, but I'm not sure of exactly how things happened or what happened. Or I'm not sure if this makes sense, but the car had no lights. I don't know if this is clear at all, but I think the other car was reversing. So you can put these things at the beginning to show that you may not be so-called fulfilling the manner maxim completely, which means you're not saying things in the clearest and most logical way that you could. And the thing that he became most famous for is this idea that we flout the maxims. So when you so-called flouting the maxims mean you purposely violate them, and in order to create particular meanings. And so if say you're going on a blind date, somebody's setting you up for a blind date, and you ask them, okay, tell me about the person, and you say he or she has a nice personality, what implicature are you going to take from that, right? You're going to probably think, okay, he didn't mention she's good looking, or he's good looking, or whatever other aspect. He graduated from Harvard, he has an HDB flat with a Mercedes or something, whatever. So you didn't mention any of those things, just said had a nice personality, which could be a kiss of death. And these things can be, of course, played with. So in Taiwan, when I lived in Taiwan, they had an expression for this kind of situation where they would say, 他长得很守交通规矩. He looks like he follows the traffic laws, literally. But people understand what that means. In other words, like, he's not much to look at. And so, but, it's something to say. It's got more of a joke, really. Or flouting the quality maxim, when you use sarcasm, like, that was brilliant when somebody did something stupid. So saying the opposite of actually what you mean. You're violating the quality maxim, you're actually lying, but people can understand that you're lying and then make the inference from that. And then relation or relativeness. In response, can I go out to play? And the father says, did you finish your homework? Right? So that's not an answer to can I go out to play, unless you understand that the child shouldn't go out to play until after he's finished the homework. And then manner, a wedding ring should be tight. After all, its purpose is to limit your circulation, right? So why are wedding rings tight? Like I can't get mine off, but it's supposed to limit your circulation. So here the manner is purposely ambiguous. So remember, he said one of the things was do not be ambiguous. But with humor, we often are purposely ambiguous. Like in this one, the circulation meaning the circulation of your finger, but also your circulation in society. So in some cases, we purposely want to violate the manner maxim and be ambiguous or be unclear. There are many other cases where you could do this. He came up with different types of implicature, actually. The conversational implicature is the kind we've been talking about, and it must be capable of being worked out the way I showed you. But it also includes a subtype known as generalized conversational implicature, which isn't really worked out so much, although because we kind of do it automatically, which is somewhat less dependent on a specialized context. The implicature associated with the use of an indefinite pronoun with alienable entities. So if you say something like, he's meeting a woman this evening, the implicature there is that it's not his wife. Right? So, or if you say, I broke a finger, usually you would assume it's your own finger and not somebody else's finger, right? Unless you're a mobster and maybe you go around breaking people's fingers or whatever. Or a car ran over John's cat. So in this case, it's not your own car. I mean, you're not your own car. If it was your car, you wouldn't say a car unless you're trying just to avoid responsibility. This one, you can't really read this well, but it says, a man in Florida safely landed a plane after the pilot died in mid-flight. Although not stated, the assumption is that the man involved was not himself a pilot. So this one is kind of interesting that they had to clarify that, because normally I guess you assume that if somebody, a man in Florida, when you say a man in Florida landed a plane, it's like, well, pilots do this all the time. But they have to clarify that a man means a man who is not a pilot. So then it becomes newsworthy. Or here, Alice, one time I was trying to get Alice to collaborate with me on a research project and a grant proposal. And so I texted her, I said, hi Alice, please answer my email about collaborating on a grant. And she said, sorry, got a family in our house. I said, no problem, but by this do you mean a family other than your own? That is, normally there is a family in your house, right? And she said, ha 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 ha, you caught me. In other words, she was violating it by saying a family when it usually wouldn't refer to your own family as a family, right? So she's violating that generalized kind of thing. And then there's conventional implicatures that are not worked out at all. They're so-called grasped intuitively, and they can't be kind of canceled the way the others can. The others you can kind of deny you intended that meaning. So he argued, for example, that therefore is a conventionalized implicature. It actually doesn't mean the same thing as necessarily the case. So, like you say, he is an Englishman. He is therefore brave. He argued that the meaning of therefore as showing causation was actually an implicature. That the word therefore doesn't really mark causation or doesn't have that meaning. Clearer example is something like she's poor but honest, where poor in logic just means and, really, but really means and, not poor, but means and in logic. But in this case, she's poor but honest. But when we say poor, we assume, he said the kind of contrast meaning, but actually has three meanings in natural language, but he was talking about the contrast meaning of she's poor but honest, as if poor people aren't normally honest. So the but here kind of contrasts, puts this contrasting meaning in, and you would draw the implicature that the speaker thinks that poor people aren't normally honest. So but has this kind of contrary sense. So it's some kind of contrast or contrariness. And when you say even, so the contrary to expectation, like even John came to the party, you weren't expecting John to come, but even he came. Or you didn't expect anybody to come, but even John came. Yet, when you say something like he hasn't come yet, there is an expectation that things will be different at a later time. So in other words, if I say he hasn't come yet, means I'm expecting him to come soon. And then the end I talked about it means then, means and then, or plus this, so John and Bill means John plus Bill. So like she suggested tulips, but I chose carnations, shows contrast. Even Jack turned up at the concert, contrary to expectation. Bill isn't here yet. Bill will come later. She was happy and ready to work. So here you have the iconic order, and you also have this sense of she was happy and plus she was ready to work. She got dressed and left the house. This one is iconic order only, but I guess you could also read plus or and then in there. This one you can't read. This is from the book, so I'm not going to go through it carefully, but you can see in the book, just in case it's not clear to you, what she has up here is the conventional literal meaning, so-called literal meanings, like when you say Fido is a dog. And then you have conversational implicature, like is the Pope Catholic, very, not straightforward. Then you have short-circuited implicatures, like can you pass the salad? And then the top part is more conventional, the lower part is less conventional. So like sheathe thine impatience, where you're using impatience like as if it represents a sword, because otherwise why would you shield it? Shield means put it into a shield, into a sex scabbard. X mind is a meadow in winter. So these are kind of unconventional, not things that are conventionalized, but you can use them anytime. And you can also make indirect references to some kind of new metaphors or implicature of a new metaphor. So this is just examples of how wide a range of different things are involved here. I don't necessarily go with this way of trying to nail it down, because for me, all of language is based on implicature, really, if you want to talk about it, because this is what I've been talking about from the beginning of inferring the speaker's intention. So what I've done is taken Grice's essential insight and then just say, well, actually, it's not limited to just these few instances. It's really how we communicate all the time, right? By inferring the other person's intention, because we assume the other person is rational. Whatever they do, whether it's linguistic or non-linguistic, and like I mentioned, Grice did also mention that it has to do with, since it's about intention, then it can also be with non-linguistic things as well. So when we're inferring somebody's intention, it's much more general, and it's hard to just kind of nail it down. But it is true that some things do become conventionalized, some things do are kind of more conventionalized than others, I should put it that way. Now, one of the more interesting things about it is the multiple levels of implicatures that we can draw. So we call these strong versus weak implicatures. So if you say something like, would you like to see a movie tonight? Somebody asks you, would you like to see a movie tonight? And you say, thanks, but I have an important test tomorrow morning. In order to make sense of that, the person has to be able to realize the relevance of having an important test, it seems to be a relevant answer to, do you want to see a movie? What does a test have to do with a movie? So you have to have some kind of understanding that, okay, if you have a test tomorrow morning, you probably want to study tonight so that you do well on the test the next morning and get to bed early. So you don't want to go out to a movie, stay up late, and not study. So the thing is, though, so the main, the implicated conclusion, the strong implicature, I mean, is that B cannot go to the movies that night, right? Or is chosen not to go to the movies that night. But there's also a weak implicature that were it not for having the test the next day, B would go to A with the movies. Now, very often, the reason why B says it in the way that they say it, instead of just saying no, the reason why B says, I have an important test tomorrow morning, is particularly for the weak implicature, not for the strong implicature. The strong implicature you could get from other ways. You could get from saying just no, or some other way of turning down the offer. But by saying it this way, I have an important test tomorrow morning, bringing up the test, you're bringing up some, objective factor that seems to be getting in the way of you doing it. And were it not for that obstacle, you would go with the person. So that's why I say in order to convey this weak implicature that the particular form of the utterance is used. Now, what's interesting about this is it may be the person really does feel that way and might follow it up. The way you tell whether somebody really intends it to mean it's only because of this objective obstacle that I can't go with you is they will follow it up by saying, how about next week? Or something like that. But if they just leave it with this and not follow it up by anything, then they might be just letting you down easy. Just a way of saying no that's not going to hurt your feelings. So we often do these kind of things for politeness. So we will kind of make up some kind of objective fact rather than saying, well, I don't really want to go out with you. You just make up some kind of objective thing that will get in the way. And so then you just leave it at that. But if it's really something that you do want to do and there just happens to be this thing that's a problem, then you try to get around it by saying, okay, next week, or how about on the weekend, or whatever. So you can have multiple weak implicatures. The proposition, like I mentioned here, conveyed by the weak implicature doesn't have to be true. It might be just trying to be polite to the person, to save the person's face and not rejecting them. And the strength of an implicature is directly proportional to the degree to which the speaker takes responsibility for the hearer making that particular interpretation. So this is why I said if B wanted to make sure that A made that interpretation, then B could add, how about next week, or some other such expression. Okay. Okay, so that's the main aspects of what we normally think of as implicature. Are there any questions up to now? I'm going to cover some other things that aren't always included in implicature, but I want to talk about. Any questions about implicature? You've had this stuff before, right? Yeah. So I got some nods. No questions. Everything's crystal clear.
So
okay.
When we talk about strong implicature and weak implicature, is it that there's a kind that's always considered strong and a kind that's always considered weak, or is it kind of?
Oh, each case is going to be individual, so you have to see it based on that situation. So it's all creating meaning, and so it's just that we don't necessarily just create one meaning, one proposition. There might be a number of things that we will associate with that, and so those are the strong versus weak implicatures. And then the interesting thing is that sometimes we're actually shooting for those weak implicatures more than the strong implicature. Of course, the strong implicature is important, but we choose that particular way of making the utterance, that particular ostensive act, in order to get the person to create those secondary meanings. It's the same idea basically as presupposition, but in this case, it's not presupposed information, it's actually asserted information. So, any other questions, comments? So, coherence is another thing that people had a lot of trouble with dealing with. Michael Halliday was one of the earliest people to kind of get a grip on it, but even he tried to show that there were things in the text that aided coherence, and that's true. That how we phrase something will help us create coherence. But it's a matter of actually the person being able to make sense of the text. In other words, to see the goal of the writer or speaker in the text. So can the hearer or reader make inferences necessary to relate the content of one sentence with that of another in such a way that the hearer or reader can figure out the speaker's intention? The easier it is for the hearer or reader to make sense of the text, the more coherent it is. And so this is where people talk about, good writing is how well there's a flow. In other words, the so-called flow means how well can I connect up the different sentences. They're not choppy. So-called choppy means, you really have to work to connect this sentence with the following sentence. Whereas if there's a nice flow of things, and most linguistic theories don't really deal with this, but Halliday's systemic functional linguistics does deal with that in a big way. That's why it's very useful for writing. What basically happens, though, is again, you're really just trying to figure out the speaker's intention in putting the sentences together in the way they did. And so it's really not something special and something different. It's just a matter of saying, okay, well, he said this sentence, and then he said that sentence, and okay, how do they relate to each other? So what's the relevance between those two sentences? And we have markers in the text, like therefore, or contrary to that, or whatever, that sometimes help us with these kind of contrasts. But if you read something like classical Chinese, there are very few of these types of things, and so very often you have to really just use a lot of inference to try to figure out what the relationship is between things. Especially something like, if you've ever read Confucius's Luanyu, the Confucius Analects, which he didn't write. It's just a bunch of his students took a lot of random sentences and put them together, and it really doesn't gel at all. It's really very difficult to try to make sense of, because it's really not meant to make sense in a sense. Does that make sense? Anyway, it was just a bunch of things that Confucius said, and they collected it all together and kind of put it together into a book, but it doesn't flow like a real book, like Zhuangzi or something like that. Okay. So another thing that's one of the things that certain people like Larry Horn work on a lot is scalar implicature. Now this is an interesting thing that you will notice in your everyday life, and maybe you can see some for your tooth slips. Certain information is always communicated by choosing a word which expresses one value from a scale of values. So this is kind of what Michael Halliday talked about, is this kind of paradigmatic sense of grammar, where if you have all of these words, like all, most, many, some, few, always, sometimes, you pick one out of that set, then you're kind of implying that it's not one of the others, right? So when producing an utterance which produces a scalar implicature, you choose a word from the scale which is the most informative and truthful in the circumstances. But so then what's assumed is that's the closest one, and so it kind of blocks out all of the others. So, like in this case, this woman is a woman from Holland, and she. I was asking her to come to something in a seminar, the talk we were giving. She said, "Thanks, Randy. Have a good seminar, and sorry I won't be able to attend some of it." So what is that? What's the implicature there? This is scalar implicature. I mean, she's using it kind of incorrectly because she actually didn't come at all. But the implication is that she will go to some of it, but not all of it. So when you say some, it means not all. That's the scalar implicature. So if you see, on this scale here, so you have all. So if you say some, then you mean not all, not most, not many, not few, not often, not sometimes. Basically, that's what you're doing. So that's a scalar implicature. Or in this one, I love you more today than yesterday, but not as much as tomorrow. And she says, so you love me slightly less than you could. And so that's a scalar implicature as well. Or like one time, we took some of the research assistants out to lunch, and on the way back we were talking about driving. Some people, and I said, oh yeah, some people don't have a lot of experience, so they're kind of scared when they're driving. But I started driving when I was 16. That's more than 10 years, and they all laughed. Why would they laugh? Because obviously when I was 16 was a bit more than 10 years ago. But by saying that was more than 10 years ago, there's a scalar implicature that it's not really much more than 10 years ago. It's not 40 years ago, right? Or 50, let's say 40. Let's leave it at that. So that's also a kind of, a scalar implicature joke. Didn't go well with this crowd, but they laughed. Anyway, they got it. Or I'm doing a major in linguistics and I've completed some of the requirements, which means what? You haven't completed all of them. If you say I've completed some of the requirements, that means you haven't completed all of them. And when we correct ourselves with scalar implicatures, we often cancel one of the scalar implicatures. So for example, I got some of these antiques in London. Hang on. Actually, I think I got most of them there. So here you're actually correcting the scalar implicature by saying, I actually got most of them. You're saying, okay, I picked the wrong word out of that set, out of that scale. Okay, and we talked about reference, and we discussed in the lecture on sense and reference how the expression can be used by a speaker for an extremely wide range of meanings, basically, infinite polysemy. And the hearer must use inference to determine which reference or meaning is intended. And so in the book they talk about, I bought IBM at 71. And so this is also, in a sense, the same thing. This is why I keep saying this is always really just about inferring the speaker's intention. So in all of these cases, you're inferring the speaker's intention. Metonymy, the same thing, referring to something by mentioning something which is related, which is also, we talked about in reference when you say this, the ham sandwich also wants an order of fries. This is, again, simply just in assuming the person is rational, and so we know that ham sandwiches don't order fries, so we must assume that it must have something to do with the person related to the ham sandwich, so the one who ordered the ham sandwich. So this is also the same kind of inferential process as working out implicature. And cynic, though, referring to something by referring to one of its parts, or referring to one of the parts by referring to the whole. So like saying 50 head of cattle when you mean 50 cows, or the army when you're talking about a single soldier, are aspects of this phenomenon. But again, when someone says 50 head of cattle, you really don't think he's going to deliver a bunch of heads. You would think he's going to bring the whole cattle with you. So this, again, because it wouldn't seem relevant or make sense to you to just bring the heads. And so you make sense of it by again, going back to what I talked about in the first lecture as assumed normality, right? So we have this, what we think of as normal. So it's it might be normal for a cattle rancher to bring 50 head of cattle, but not 50 heads from cattle or something. And speech acts. We talked about speech acts. We saw that what's important in understanding speech acts is the illocutionary force. You have to infer the intention of the speaker. The illocutionary force is conveyed as an inference the addressee is expected to make from the utterance of a form in a particular context. So that is, the hearer will assume whatever the speaker says is relevant in some way, and so try to make sense of it by assuming the illocutionary force that makes the most sense in that context. So this explains why a single NP, like the laundry, or non-linguistic cues, like I did to them earlier when I first came in, they were sitting together, and I just went like that, and they understood immediately that I move aside, move one seat apart. So you can do that because it's the same thing. It's like, I don't do this as a normal thing. So they must think, okay, he's rational. He's not crazy. He's not like Trump doing this all the time. He did this for a particular reason. We inferred what that reason is, and then we acted. I didn't have to say anything. It's the same thing if you say a word like laundry. I've had quite a few tutorial slips where people talk about their mother telling them it's raining, which means you have to get up and close the windows or in the apartment or something like that. So it's the same kind of thing. You get the illocutionary force out of making sense of, okay, why did the person say this in this context at this time to me? And now many of the so-called indirect speech actors short-circuited implicatures, utterances that when they were first used involved the hero working out the inferences to derive the imperative sense, but later became conventionalized enough that they don't need to be worked out. So this is what's called the short-circuited implicatures. So when we say something like, can you please close the door? The fact of being able to put the word please in there shows how the construction, can you please X, is very conventionalized as a request. And presupposition we talked about. We saw in the last lecture that presuppositions are very much context dependent, in that they're suspendable and depend on information structure of the clause. So if the clause is about some thing, idea, or person, then there is a presupposition that the thing, idea, or person exists, is true. Compare that her guests are vegetarians may be worrying her, and she may be worrying that her guests are vegetarians. So when you make it the topic, like that her guests are vegetarians, it's presupposed to be the case. But she may be worrying that her guests are vegetarians, it's not presupposed that her guests are vegetarians. Presuppositions are just implicatures that are required in some context for the utterance to make sense. So it's really goes back to all the same thing. So this is why, trying to come up with separate ways of analyzing speech acts and presuppositions and reference and all these different things as if they're totally unrelated things that we do, it's really all goes back to the same basic principle of just trying to make sense of the attention of the speaker. In semantics, which I don't believe in, it's often assumed that the meaning of complex noun phrases can be described by reference to the meaning of the elements of its composition. And much of linguistic analysis is based on this compositional analysis or componential. Sometimes they call componential analysis because you think of it as a bunch of components and a building block kind of way, that you have these individual units like words and form classes, and then you build up larger structures from that, but everything goes actually back to those individual components. So there's this idea that the meaning of complex noun phrases can be described by reference to the meaning of the elements of its composition, but as there is no marking of the relation of nouns or adjectives to the head noun in a complex noun phrase, the addressee must use inference to determine which of the many possible meanings the speaker intends when using the complex noun phrase. For example, if I say I want a blue pen, do I mean a pen that has blue ink or one that has a blue shell? Maybe I'm wearing a blue suit, so I want a pen with a blue cover, to stick out of my pocket or something. Who knows? Or criminal in criminal law means it's about crime, but criminal in criminal activities means activities that are illegal. Right? In avocado shampoo, the shampoo may be made of avocados, but in rug shampoo, the shampoo is probably not made of rug. It's generally used to mean a shampoo for cleaning rugs, right? Now, we don't think about these when we hear words like this, but this whole inference to infer, you have to infer to real world knowledge. Again, assume normality. Do we clean avocados? We can actually. There are things you can buy to wash your fruit and your vegetables. Liquid soap, especially for cleaning fruit and vegetables. But if you say avocado shampoo, I think most people would think that, well, shampoo is normally for washing hair, not for fruit. So avocado shampoo must be made of avocados rather than shampoo for avocados. So, we can make sense of it by inferring based on our real world knowledge. And this is what we do. I mean, we're not always very conscious of it, but it just goes to show you that the meaning, the relationship between the items and the meaning is not in the words themselves. We create that by referring, referring to our assumed normality and trying to guess why the person put the words together the way they did. And with metaphor, we use metaphors to structure and understand our world because as I mentioned earlier, you can't really understand anything new. So in order to make something relevant to you, you use a metaphor because then people can understand, oh, it's like this. When you eat some meat you never had before, oh, it's like chicken. When you try to conceive of some concept, if you can say, well, it's like this. And then people use these analogies or metaphors all the time to help them understand things. Many are so conventionalized we don't even notice their metaphors, like when you say he's in high spirits, based on the metaphor happy is up. Or don't waste my time, based on the metaphor time is money. Or his criticisms were right on target, based on the metaphor argument is war. So these things are understood. Again, you have to make reference to some shared knowledge of these metaphors in order to understand why the person is saying what they're saying. In some of the languages, when you work on other languages, you find very different types of metaphors in use. So that's one of the interesting things, is their way of conceiving the world is different. So like in one language, or Dulong, that I worked on, the way you say you're angry is you say your liver is spicy. That's how you're angry, In Chinese, you could say your liver heat came up. There's so many different metaphors that people can use to make sense of things. In other cases, the metaphor or the statement is clearly false, like he's a pig, and then you have to think, okay, why would somebody say he's a pig when it's obvious that he's not a pig? Then you have to again find the relevance of that and think, okay, in my cultural framework, what are the characteristics of a pig? Then he must be saying that this is the characteristics of a pig. And this, of course, differs between cultures. So, like I mentioned, I think, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, that, in Chinese and English, when you say he's a pig, it means totally different things. Because in English, when you say he's a pig, it means he's sloppy. In Chinese, if you say he's a pig, it means he's stupid. And in English, when we say he's a pig, we don't mean he's stupid at all. And in Chinese, it means specifically he's stupid. So it's, each culture has its own kind of assumed normality or assumed understanding of the world, and you understand these things relative to that. So I remember the reason why I mentioned this, he's a pig, is because I was talking to a Chinese guy once, and he said it first, and he said he's a pig, first in English and then in Chinese. And I noticed my brain do a little flip-flop, because I first understood it one way, and then I understood it another way. And then it became very clear to me that they were two different things entirely. When these conventionalized metaphors were first used, or when a speaker uses a new metaphor, the hearer has to understand that the literal meaning is not meant, as it's obviously not true, but that there must be some relevant connection between what is mentioned and what is intended by the speaker, and then draw the proper inferences. If it's a totally new metaphor, people may misunderstand it. And hyperbole is similar in that the statement cannot be true, like I bought 1 million new books. So the hearer must use inference to determine what the speaker intends. That should be intents, not intents. Intends by obviously making such a false statement. So it's the same in all of these cases, it's like, why did the person say that? It's not true. Same with sarcasm. If it's something that's not true. So here's a metaphor that I'd never seen before when I read this. It said, everyone in the research field agrees that for the particular purpose of replacing on-campus education, the evidence for MOOCs is ambiguous at best, said Andrew Hall, professor at the Harvard Graduate School. Far more research is needed, and we're conducting some of it, but we're way out over our skis when it comes to that particular purpose of MOOCs. I don't ski. But I can guess that if you're way out over your skis, you're probably not very stable, not very secure in what you're doing. Maybe you fall over or something. I don't know. Even with a totally new one, I mean, it certainly, he's not on skis, and he's not really talking about skis. So I have to infer, okay, what is the intention of him in saying we're way out over our skis? And these metaphors, though, can be very rich. I don't know I think I don't have time to go into this, but you can take a look at this in the handout. I'm not going to cover it. It's just a very interesting study, and I put the paper online too, so that you can read this if you want, about the role of metaphor and reasoning, how powerful these metaphors are in shaping the way we think about things. By Dirabordisky and Thibodeau. So I'm going to skip this. You can just read through it. And one of the interesting things about metaphors, though, in how they affect our way of thinking, is that once you establish the metaphor is a framework for thinking about something, and there are implications for that. It's not just simply that one thing. There are kind of associated things. So, like, there was a professor in RSIS who was a Filipino who was very pro-Duterte. And so he was asked, what about all the extrajudicial killings? That's hard to say. Because Duterte killed probably more than 10,000 people now, just arbitrary extrajudicial killings. And supposedly in this war on drugs, but it's just pretty random killings. And so the answer was, in a war, there are always civilian casualties. So once you accept this so-called war on drugs metaphor, you then you're allowing for these other implications. Okay, what in a war you have things like civilian casualties, what we call, they use the euphemism of collateral damage, but it's civilian casualties. And so he's saying that's just a normal part of war. And since we've defined this as a war, even though it's not really a war, because we've defined this as a war, then we can justify our killing of innocent people by the fact that civilians die in a war. So this is one of the problematic things with the particular ones. And one of the important types of work that George Lakoff did was pointing out to the Democrats many years ago the metaphors that they were falling for. They were buying into the Republican metaphors, and like family values and war on what was the other one? The war on terror and all these other things. And George Lakoff said, look, once you've bought into their metaphors, you've basically lost the argument. You have to avoid buying into their metaphors and create your own framework for discussions. And they did that, and that's how Obama got elected. But anyway, somehow it's not working anymore. But we'll see how things go in a couple of weeks. So I think that's all for today. Oh, there's also mixed metaphors. So sometimes people mangle these things up. This is just fun. So that we're this financial analyst, and very seriously said, talking about the budget, he said, so that we're not digging ourselves into a black hole, right? So digging yourself into a hole is one metaphor, and that's a black hole is another metaphor, and he just mixed the two together without realizing that he was doing that. And sometimes we also make reanalysis, or what we call folk etymology. We kind of reanalyze things we hear on the basis of what we think makes sense rather than what they're actually being said. So, like a friend of mine, rather than saying, we normally say wide awake, he's wide awake. But she would always say wild awake, which I like, actually. I now use myself because it makes more sense. When you're really awake, then you're wild awake. And so many people with exception proves the rule, they turned it into exception proves the rule, which actually turns it around all the way. Proofs means to test, right? Whereas proves means it asserts the truth of. So it's really quite a different thing. But the original statement is exception proves the rule. In other words, test the rules. Because if you have exceptions to your rule, you establish a rule and then you have exceptions, it tests your rule, because if you can explain the exceptions, then it shows your rule is good. But just having exceptions doesn't prove your rule is right. That's crazy, but that's what a lot of people think. Okay, that's all for today. Any questions? Okay, see you tomorrow then.